Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jill Smart, and I'll be leading our discussion this afternoon on the new pay versus performance disclosure that boards are now required to put in place for next year's proxy statements. I am joined by a few experts here from Meyer, Deb Lifshay and Sharon Pedstupka, and they're going to walk us through the details in the slides, one of the most complex and data-intensive disclosures required under Dodd-Frank. We will look at what is required, in what format, and outline several decisions that must be made along the way. We're also going to talk about the narrative and present some helpful ideas about how to frame the various data relationships. There is a lot of rich information to share, but before we begin, the NACD education team has a few housekeeping items to note, and then Deb will kick off our program. So over to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Jill. We have a few administrative announcements before we get started. First, I'll talk about the tools you have available in your webinar console. On the left-hand side of your console, you can see all of today's panelists and access their bios. In the top right corner of the webinar console, you can submit a question to be answered by our speakers during the program, time permitting. Please note that if you submit a question, you will be opted in to receive future executive compensation thought leadership from Meyer. In the bottom right corner, you can download a copy of today's slide deck and access additional resources. Today's slide deck is also available on pearlmeyer.com at the URL on your screen. As always, a recording of this webinar will be available early next week at both nacdonline.org/webinars and pearlmeyer.com. Your participation in today's live webinar earns you credit toward maintaining your NACD credential. NACD fellows and certified directors will automatically receive 1 credit for their participation. Please note that you must attend this webinar for at least 50 minutes in order to receive credit. Finally, we will have a few evaluation questions at the very end of this program, and we would appreciate your feedback. So please stick around at the end of the webcast to answer those questions. And now I'd like to turn it over to our presenter, Deb, who will get us started.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Jill. As you'll see here, we have a jam-packed agenda, but I love the first question because it's really a little bit rhetorical, but why are we here today? This rule, as many of you know, stems from the Dodd-Frank Act, which was passed by Congress in 2010, 12 years ago. And under Section 953 of the Dodd-Frank Act, Congress directed the SEC to adopt a rule requiring disclosure of the relationship between executive compensation actually paid and a company's financial performance. And that was it. That was Section 953. So at the SEC, it took 12 years for the SEC to finally get to the point where it could issue some guidance to us, because Congress didn't give much guidance to the SEC. At the time Dodd-Frank was enacted. So it's really remarkable that we're here today, 12 years later, and we're almost surprised because we got the final rules, as you all know, right before Labor Day weekend, and maybe the final rules were not a surprise, but what was surprise is that they are effective for the immediate next proxy season. So proxies filed with respect to fiscal years ending December 15th, or later. So we're really, we're in crunch time now. Not only do we have a lot of proxy and CD&A and regular decisions and things going on with the regular cycle, but now we have this very complex new rule layered on top that has new tables, new decision points, lots and lots of calculations and math, and also a bunch of narratives and graphics. So from a high level, oops, can you go back for a sec, Sharon? So first, we'll cover major decision points. As I mentioned, there's 3 things your compensation committee will need to talk about. We'll talk about, as I mentioned, the details of how compensation actually paid is calculated. So many nuances. It's constantly evolving. We got a new interpretation as late as yesterday, so this is very good timing. We'll talk about, and then we'll turn it over to Sharon, who's our communication expert, who will bring us up to date on what we think these narratives will look like and how they're forming up. So we can go to the next slide now, please. Thank you. So really, what must be disclosed? Let's look at it from a really high level. As I mentioned, Dodd-Frank Congress directed us to make some disclosure about the relationship between a new kind of compensation actually paid versus some sort of financial performance. And the two buckets that the SEC gave us guidance are how to calculate this new version of compensation and what they called compensation actually paid. And so for these new tables, what they will include are compensation specific to a CEO and compensation that is an aggregate of all other NEO compensation. And that will happen over 5 years, which is longer than our summary compensation table disclosure. It reflects our compensation actually paid, which we'll cover in detail soon, summary compensation table numbers, which are adjusted for equity values and pension values. In our performance disclosure, the SEC had a lot of measures it could have chosen to represent a company's financial performance in the relationship between company performance and compensation actually paid. Ultimately, the SEC determined that TSR would be the most appropriate measure. So we'll have to include TSR for our company and its peer group. They also added on in a reproposal that occurred in 2002, company net income. And as a concession or maybe another layer of complexity, they also now want companies to select the most important financial measure that they use to determine compensation actually paid. And one other thing they added on, which was an additional table for other measures that might drive compensation. So let's dig down a little bit further. So let's talk about these two tables. These are our two brand new tables that will occur in item 402V of the required compensation in your proxy statement starting in next year. So what you see here is exactly what it will look like. This is what it will look like, 5 years of data. We get a little bit of a break because next year we only need 3 years, the following year 4 years, and finally we'll get to year 5 in 2025. And another thing to keep in mind is if you are a smaller reporting company, you'll have scaled disclosures. So in the first year, you'll only report 2 years of data, and then it will go up to 3 years of data the following year where it will remain. Emerging growth companies, as a side note, are exempt from this disclosure requirement. So as we go column from column, in your first column, you'll list the years that you're covering. For this first year, it would be 2022, 2021, and 2020. Then you have your summary compensation total number for your CEO. This comes right off of your proxy statement that you will be filing once you have these total numbers for 2022. You already have them for 21 and 20. Then you have a number that's called compensation actually paid, which is a number where you take your summary compensation total and you replace in new values for equity and pension. Next, as I mentioned, we'll be looking at average numbers for NEOs in each year. For each year reported here, you'll look at the named executive officers as they existed in your proxy statement, and those are the NEOs you will be averaging in each year. Even if your NEOs change over time, as they do, you will not be carrying forward old named executive officers to more recent years. You'll only be representing their compensation in the years they were actually correlating to compensation in the summary compensation table. And again, then you'll find out, we'll calculate the average compensation actually paid. Then the SEC said it wants us to report TSR in a special way. It wants us to report TSR using the value of $100 of a fixed investment starting in the first year of the chart and moving forward. That means that in year 3, so let's call that the earliest year of the table, you'll be looking at the 1-year cumulative TSR from the end of 19 to the end of 20. In year 2, you'll be looking at 2-year cumulative TSR from 19 through the end of 21. And then in year 1, which is the most current, you'll have the 3-year cumulative TSR. Next, in the following column, you'll be comparing that same cumulative TSR to the of your peer group. We'll have net income, and then we'll have something called the company selected measure. So that's, in a nutshell, high level, what this new PVP table looks like. In addition, there will be a new laundry list, in which the company will decide which measures drive compensation actually paid, and you will simply list the name of the measure. There's no further disclosure required for this table. It's simply a list. Okay, we can move on.
Okay, that was a lot. That's a big table. Are we ready for the first question? So here's the question. Has your management team started working on this yet? So you can just, pick your answer and hit submit. And while we're tallying the your answers, I will tell you, so I happen to be on 3 public boards. And the answer for all of my boards is yes, we are starting to work on this. I haven't seen any preliminary versions yet, but I have actually calls set up throughout the month of November if we don't already have a comp committee, because I'm on the comp committee in all 3 companies, and I'm the chair of one of those comp committees. And so I have been hounding the CHRO and my comp consultants to make sure that at our meeting in December, we don't have any surprises or unknowns, because as one of the slides said earlier, this is a lot of data that we have to collect and gather and calculate. And so certainly we can't be waiting to start this. So do we have any results yet? I don't see any.
Yeah, let's take a look. Let's take a look.
Okay. Yeah, so a couple of suggestions just for myself. If the answer is no, I would certainly find out what the plan is and when it's going to get started and who's responsible for doing it, within the company. And obviously, if you don't know, I do think it's something that you should ask about, very, very readily. And I don't know if any of my fellow presenters have any other comments on this.
Well, I have a funny anecdote. If you read the cost-benefit analysis in the SEC rules, they anticipate that it will be an additional 28 hours total, and it would be allocated between in-house and consultants or lawyers, and the average consultant lawyer is charging $400 an hour. So I think those 2 numbers speak for themselves about sort of like the underestimate of what, how much time this will take and what the costs are you might incur.
Well, personally, I think 28 hours is not the right number of hours, but we shall see, won't we? Yeah, that's because they don't have to do the work, right?
Great. All right. So coming back to these major decision points that we have to talk about, where they go, that go into these 2 tables, and we'll go into depth in these. How do I choose the peer group for TSR? How do I choose my company selected measure? And what do I put in my tabular list? So on that note, Jill, why don't you hit the first question we have?
Oh, okay. I didn't know if you wanted to have some conversation on it yet. Okay, so have you chosen the peer group that will be used? Let's do that. And I can tell you for my boards, we're not yet. It's not 100%, but we are definitely having conversations around it. So I know this is kind of a yes-no question about whether you've chosen them, but hopefully you're at least talking about that and coming back with recommendations.
Right. I mean, the rules provide a very prescribed option for choosing your peer group, which we'll cover in a little bit of detail, but we thought we'd ask the question first to see if this,
yeah, that's right.
This kind of decision point has been percolating.
So should we see if we have some results? Yeah, let's check it out.
Okay, it's actually, look at it, it's very similar. A little bit, maybe a few more no's than this time. And again, my guess is that maybe if there was a selection of we're in the process of doing it, so we've started it, perhaps we'd get a lot more yeses than the no's. And again, I would just ask if you don't know. And I love that, you know, we're being honest with each other here, right? If you don't know, I just think it's really key to at least ask the question. Okay, discuss the different groups.
Sure. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about the complexity. And remember at the beginning of this presentation, I mentioned that there are a lot of nuances, a lot of open questions in the FCC guidance. And this has been a question that's really, it's been evolving. And every day I talk to different practitioners, we come out with different conclusions about what is permissible. But at very high level, what the rules say is that the peer group that you're using for this cumulative TSR comparison, it must either be the peer group that you used for compensation benchmarking in the compensation discussion and analysis, or a peer group that's used back in the 10K in the performance graph, which is a place many compensation practitioners don't even look at or pay attention to. But it's back there, and there are different items that are compared in this performance graph. So when we first talked about this at a high level, most practitioners were saying, well, maybe we should just use the peer group in the performance that's used. We should use the 10K index in the performance graph because it's easier, it doesn't change over time, and we won't have to explain it. And then we had a whole camp of people saying, well, let's use our compensation discussion and analysis peer group because it might have better alignment with the compensation actually paid. There are pluses and minuses to both groups. The first is, if you're trying to use your peer group used in a CD&A, keep in mind it cannot be a performance-based peer group. Some of us have those where we use performance, a separate performance peer group to measure how we did in our LTI programs. It can't be we believe it cannot simply be a reference CD peer group. So you say that we look at these for market practices and references, but we don't actually benchmark. The growing consensus is it needs to be a peer group that is benchmarked in the CD&A. Another catch with using your peer group CD&A is that it must be market weighted each year, which typically doesn't happen when you're using it to benchmark in the CD&A. And probably the worst of all is if you use your peer group, anytime there's a change in your peer group, which happens quite often, whether you're changing industries or you're changing the size group, or some peers fall in or out due to merger and acquisition activity, every time that happens, in the footnotes to your PVP table, you are going to have to talk about not only the current peer group PVP, but also the prior year PVP peer group and what their TSR was. So it's going to greatly expand the complexity of the footnotes of your PVP table. So the other camp really preferred using some index in the performance graph because we would say, well, this is a compliance exercise. Let's just pull that. Let's not worry about changing peer groups. The catch there is that you cannot use the broad index. So if there's an S&P 500 in there, you can't use that. It must be a published industry or line of business index from the performance graph. Some companies don't have that in their performance graph. They simply have a broad index. So if that is the case, it is true that it is not too late to change your 10K disclosure. But once you have that peer group in the 10K disclosure and you choose to use it as your index, if you want to change going forward, you might run into the same problem of having to compare one index to another index over time. So those are sort of the complexities of going into the decisions of what do I use for this peer group TSR column in my PVP. All right.
Should I take us to our next poll?
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to say, did you want to say something, though, before we did this?
So I wanted to say again that we're asking this question before we tell you, we go into really all the details of it, but it's really just to sort of see a benchmark survey of who thought of this.
Yeah, exactly. So this question is about the other decision that needs to be made around the company selected measure, the CSM, and whether you have selected that yet. And we really didn't ask if you're doing more than one, but have you chosen the CSM yet? So let's go ahead and submit that. And I can tell you for my boards, the answer is no. We are going to discuss it at our next meeting. And, you know, obviously what I do is I meet with the CHRO and CFO, et cetera, and we figure out what we're going to recommend before we go to the rest of the comp committee. That's what we're doing. And then we'll bring that, you know, to the board to make sure that they are. But we're starting, that's the way that we're going about it. So let's see if we have any results yet. Yep, I'm not surprised at this, that we have more no's on this one than on the other ones. And again, just suggest for the don't knows to inquire. Now we can talk about CSM.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So CSM, remember, this is the last column of your PVP table, and it's a column that represents a financial performance measure that's chosen by the company that you believe most closely correlates to your compensation actually paid. It can be a non-GAAP number. If it is non-GAAP, you need to include a description, how you just derive the number that you're using from financial statements. And once you choose your CSM, it will naturally be occurring and listed in your tabular list of measures, which is the following chart we'll talk about. So some complexities that have come up as people are talking about how do I choose my CSM, and I think, Jill, you mentioned this too, or maybe companies are choosing two CSMs. If you do choose two CSMs, you will have to have an additional column, which adds some complexity. And as Sharon will demonstrate later, it will be a lot of additional complexity in terms of relationships. Because remember, for your TSR, your net income, and your company selected measure, you're going to have to describe the relationship back to the compensation actually paid. So keep that in mind if you want to be, you know, a real, like, really aggressive and a great disclosure person, maybe just comply this year instead of trying to being too complete. Another question we've gotten is, what drives compensation? Should it be based on what the company philosophy is as the most important measure driving strategy, or should it be formulaic? In other words, what was the actual measure in my short-term plans or my long-term plans that actually resulted in the largest amount of pay proportionally in the total compensation? I think what most practitioners are really discussing is it should be based in philosophy, because that is what is theoretically driving and should be driving compensation decisions from the compensation committee. If you have, this is another little tricky item where some companies might not even have another financial measure other than TSR and net income. If you don't have a financial measure, a third one that actually drives performance, you don't have to include this column. It's probably a rare case, but if you don't have it, you don't have it. You can't make it up. So then we would just highly recommend that you footnote that you don't have another financial measure driving compensation. And then another really interesting point that many clients have been discussing, it's a little cute, but we do think that the SEC deems it permissible, is if I could use relative TSR or stock price as my company selected measure, because theoretically, compensation actually paid is a derivative of stock price, because you're looking at the value of equity over time, which is driven primarily, if not exclusively, by stock price. So wouldn't it be great to just put stock price in there, and you'll have really good alignment, as we'll show you later, between stock price and your compensation actually paid. So those are some of the nuances and tidbits we've been talking to clients about. I don't know if, Jill, have you run across any of those kinds of issues?
You know, not yet, but I do have a question for you, because I've run across this. So what if let's say we only want to use one, right? Like you said, like let's make sure we just comply. What if we have two that we use very, evenly, like that bonus and equity and, all kinds of things are measured 50-50 from an algorithm on two different measures? Would you suggest that we do have to use those or should use those two? And if not, how do you pick one of those?
I mean, I do think it's unusual that both the formulaic and the philosophical, goals and outcomes are always 50-50. So you might want to look at those two sides, because usually when you look at compensation philosophy, there's really one driving factor. So I would recommend that you really do try to figure out the most important and put that in your PVP table. And then for your second most important, you can certainly list it in your tabular table, but it avoids having to show yet another relationship and narrative when you have to do that in the charts later on.
Yeah, okay. All right, great, thank you.
All right, I'll take us to the next poll.
Okay, which is, if it's been decided upon, which we know that not very many have, is it prevalent in one of your incentive plans? I'm kind of assuming that the answer is going to be yes, or which one is it? So let's go ahead and, could be both, right?
Yeah.
Because we didn't have that as an option.
All right. Okay, I'm just giving it a second so we can get some results. Okay, here we go. Oh, that's interesting.
Okay. Yeah. Neither.
I mean, I'm not surprised here, because I'm not surprised that long-term is greater than short-term, because theoretically long-term should be bigger than short-term in a good governance kind of plan.
Do you have any, I know, we can't ask the folks that answer this, but do you have any insight as to why it would be neither? That it's not in the incentive plan?
I'm guessing the neither might represent the people who maybe haven't started thinking about it or haven't got dug deep yet, because
okay, yeah,
as we'll talk about as we go through this, yeah.
Yeah. Because I can't think of a reason why we would have chosen something that isn't prevalent in one of our incentive plans. But
right,
we'll
unless you're a company that, I mean, there is the rare case of perhaps a company that doesn't have, that third financial measure to disclose, and maybe it's driven more by strategic or, the development of some R&D kind of product.
Okay, all right, great.
All right.
All right, great. So now we come to this laundry list. This is my favorite list. It's a tabular selection. And it's sort of interesting because I have some clients that are really excited to populate charts and get things done. And so there's 3 to 7 measures. It's an unranked list. And a lot of clients want to, their immediate reaction was to populate, throw in 7 things to show we're, exhibiting good governance and we have a lot of things driving compensation. And that answer is inherently just wrong. It's wrong because you want whatever you put in here to be meaningful, and you want it to, the most important thing of items that go in this tabular list is that they align with the compensation discussion and analysis. Because as Sharon will get into shortly, the compensation discussion and analysis section of your proxy is where you tell your story. At this juncture, the PVP table, it is and should be reviewed as a compliance measure only, particularly in this year, because we believe that for you to say that compensation, these are measures that drove compensation and that's why they relate back to compensation actually paid, is a bit disingenuous, mostly because these rules were put into place after most of the decisions for the year, setting goals, setting thresholds, were established earlier in the year. So if they happen to align, that's great, but there was no decision-making process that went into alignment. And so that's sort of my background spiel on tabular measures. They really, really need to be aligned with and contained in your compensation discussion analysis, there should be no measures in this table that are not already measured in your CD&A. Would you agree with that, Sharon?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think the discussions are interesting because, you know, for certain companies, you know, there are measures in the incentive plans that may not be financial, right? So there's the focus on ESG and potentially getting credit for ESG in this table. And if there aren't measurable ESG measures in your plan, maybe this is not the place for it.
Right. So a couple of technicalities about what you'll see in this tabular measure section. First, as I mentioned earlier, you must include whatever you pick as your company selected measure must be in this chart. It's unranked, so you can put it wherever you want. It may include, if in fact this is the case, net income and TSR, which will already be in your PVP table. The SEC has directed that it would like 3 to 7 measures in this table, 3 of which should be financial. However, then they back down from it and say, if you do not, in fact, have financial measures, you can use other measures. So they don't have to be all financial. There doesn't have to be 3 of them. But if you do have 3 financial measures, you're supposed to list them. And another nuance, which we don't recommend if it's possible, is the SEC allows you to make multiple tabular tables, multiple tables, right? So you could have a list of goals for your CEO, you can have a list of goals for your average NEOs, and then you can have a table for each of the NEOs if you want. So it could get really cumbersome and really complicated, and we recommend against that unless in the rare case where each of your executives have very distinct measures driving performance.
And Deb, what you don't have to do here is sort of defend this table within, you know, the same space. So narrative-wise, you don't need to explain each of the measures listed in the table. It's truly just a list.
That's right. And that's why, to Jill's point, you know, if I have 2 compensation company selected measures, that they're both great, they both drive, I would say really pick the one that just inches out above the other, put that in the PVP table, and put your second measure in this table, and you never have to explain it again.
Right.
Yeah.
All right.
All right, so now we come to math. This is the math portion of this exercise. And frankly, this is the section that directors might not get into the weeds on, compensation consultants even might not, and lawyers probably not. But it's really important to understand because it takes so much time and there's so many awards that you need to revalue now to get to this compensation actually paid. So what is this weird number that's now coming through in addition to our summary compensation table? And it's pretty simple as a concept. What the SEC was after was tracking and valuing awards over years and what the value is to the executive. The SEC has taken a position that the one value that comes through in summary compensation table, right, your grant date fair value, where you visit it once in the year of grant and you never see it again come through in the summary compensation table at least, that's not really what Congress was getting at here. What they were getting at is a year-over-year comparison of company performance to compensation actually paid for that year. And so what the SEC said is we want you to back out this big grant date fair value, and we want to look at each and every award over the course and life of that award until it vests. So you can see here how this would work. So you would back out from your summary compensation table total, your grant date fair value, and then you would add in the value of awards as they vest and as they mature over time. So for example, 2022 will be our most current year that we're reporting in the table this year. For 2022, we would be recording awards granted in the current year. If it doesn't vest in the current year, we're going to look at the fair value at the end of 2022. If for some reason you grant something in 22 and it also vests in 22, we will take the fair value at the date of vest. And for these purposes, let's assume we have a simple time-based restricted stock grant. So that would simply be the number of shares times stock price. How about old grants? So maybe I have an old grant that was made in 2019, 2020. It's still vesting in 2022. In that case, if it remains unvested, what the SEC wants to see is how did the fair value change from last year to this year? So I would look at the fair value of this unvested award at the end of last year, and I would compare it to the fair value at the end of this year. If that award that was granted prior to 2022 actually vests in 2022, I would compare the fair value at the end of last year to the fair value of vesting this year. I would also take out the fair value of anything that is forfeited during the year, and that amount would equal the fair value as of the last year. I would add back in, and this is different, and we'll go into this a little bit, the dividends paid on unvested shares, any value attributable to incremental fair value on a modified option or STAR. And then for pension, another piece of this equation, I take out from my summary compensation table the actuarially increase or decrease of pension, which is normally in the summary compensation table. And instead, I substitute what the SEC deems as a more important measure of compensation actually paid for the year, which is how much did my pension increase, the value of my pension increase, only attributable to my being there an extra year. So we ignore for this purposes interest rates and volatility of the pension itself. So I know that's a lot, but as you can see, I demonstrate this to tell you that we are doing this for each and every award, for each and every executive that is in the table. So if you can imagine multiple awards over multiple years that are vesting in different increments, it's really hard to do on a simple time-based restricted stock, but if you've got an option, you're taking multiple Black-Scholes values based on the fair value to get fair value at different points in time. Even harder, if you've got some sort of performance-based award at each fair value date, you'll have to look at where that performance award is tracking and sort of take the target for where it's tracking the expected value for that year. Layer on top of that any kind of market-based awards, and you'll have to get a Monte Carlo simulation for each and every award that's in process. So that's a lot, right?
A lot.
I didn't want to, it's a lot. I didn't want to go crazy with a very big example because that would take up giant chunks of our time, and you're welcome to call us to talk about it. But let me just break it down with one simple example. Let's say in March of 2022, you make a grant to an executive of 100 shares. At that time, it's $10. So if I were just in my normal summary compensation table, the grant date fair value would be $1,000. I would never see that again after this year. But now I'm backing out that $1,000, and instead, if I make this grant on March 1st, 2022 at $10, and it's outstanding at the end of the year, by the end of the year, it's only $7. What I'm going to report on this is the $700 because I'm taking the fair value at year end rather than grant date fair value. Let's say
and
another variation is,
I'm assuming, oh, sorry. I was just going to say in that example, none of it is vested yet. Is that correct or no?
That's correct. Once these awards vest, we're done with reporting. You report for the year of vest, and future years that award is dead for purposes of this table. Let's take it one step further, and then I'll stop with math. Let's say we still have this award granted in March of 2022 at $10, 100 shares. It's still invested at the end of next year, so at the end of 2023. So as we mentioned, we assumed at the end of 2022, stock price was $7. My fair value at the end of last year was $700. Let's assume the stock price went up a little bit. At the end of 2023, it's now $11. So my fair value at the end of 2023 is $1,100. But what the SEC actually wants to see is the difference in fair value from this year to last year. So what I would report is 1,100 minus 700, which would be only 400. So that's sort of like a very, very simple example of how an award might run through these tables.
That I actually found very helpful, so thank you. I like the simplicity of it.
We have a really, really complicated ones if anybody wants to ping me after, but I thought for purposes of this, we're good.
Oh, I'd like to see that one.
All right, let's move on.
Sure.
Okay. Here's a couple of nuances we just wanted to point out with this compensation actually paid, which now everybody is calling.
I think we need the next slide.
Are we a closer look at CAP? Yeah,
okay.
I think we're good.
Sorry.
I just wanted to point out a couple of things I think you've already seen, I've already mentioned, and you already get that this is going to take a lot of time, expense, and resources to collect data, calculate data, and put it in the chart. So get started now. Another interesting piece of this is, as I mentioned, if you have a performance-based award, you're now reporting the value of this while it's in cycle. So there might be new disclosure about how awards are tracking. There's a lot of disagreement as late as last night about what you do and when you value an award that is given to somebody who becomes retirement eligible during the life of the award, yet they're still working, but they become vested as a result of becoming retirement eligible. Half of the camp is now saying you take that hit in PVP at the time the person becomes retirement eligible, and then now there's a whole new line of thought that you wait until the award actually vests. We are desperately in need of SEC guidance on this point, so stay tuned on that. Another point I wanted to mention, which a lot of people forget, is that dividends, as they are paid or accrued, must be included in the year that they are paid or accrued prior to the year of vest. That is the opposite from how we calculate grant date fair value. Grant date fair value essentially disregards dividends because the theory is that they're already included in the price of the stock. All right, let's move on. Sharon, Tag, you're it. Where are we putting all of this disclosure?
So that's a really great question, Deb. And I think, what we've been talking about with our clients and what we've been hearing in, all of these discussions that we've been having is that nowhere does anyone want to see this within the CD&A. The CD&A should continue to stand alone. It should continue to be sort of that centerpiece where you tell your compensation story, what the board's intentions are around pay for performance, and that this particular disclosure should really be treated similar to what we did back when we had to deal with the CEO pay ratio. So it should come either before or after the CEO pay ratio, after the CD&A. Some folks are talking about tucking it behind the termination tables, and I think that makes good sense. And really, it's interesting as you go through all of these slides and especially talk about the complexities of calculating CAP, the last part of the rule is sort of interesting because it states that the disclosure must include a quote-unquote clear description of the various pay versus performance relationships in these buckets that we've been talking about. So CEO and average other NEO compensation actually paid versus company cumulative TSR versus the company net income versus the company's company selected measure, and then the company's cumulative TSR versus the peer group's cumulative TSR. So to tell that story can be pretty complicated. And because the rule doesn't prescribe the way in which companies need to do this, it's really up to each company to decide how they want to present the content, either using words or visuals or even a combination of both. So, with that said, I think I keep returning to this year's guiding principle, which is, and Deb, you've said it a number of times, is we should all remember that this is year one of a brand new compliance exercise. Now, as the creative writer in the bunch, I would love to tell story after story after story, but I do agree that, you know, most of what we're hearing and having discussions around is being as conservative as possible in this first year, and for two good reasons. One, I don't think anyone wants to lead the creative pack here. And second, there are real concerns about the potential for setting precedents for future disclosures. And because this rule hit us so fast, we really don't have an opportunity to even talk about what might be best practice. So keeping it really simple, you know, there have been discussions about the best way to do this. Should it be visual? Should it be words? And we'll look at a few quick examples. But before we do that, I think it's really important to reinforce again that we don't want the readers of the proxy statement, our investors in particular, to use the PVP disclosure as their sole source of their decision making. So it's going to be really important to make sure that they understand, and there's some sort of caveat to say that the full discussion about how the board and the compensation committee makes decisions about executive pay is described in the CD&A of the proxy statement. And not to put any pressure on anybody out there, but I think it also heightens the need to make sure that your CD&A is fairly bulletproof. So let's just look at, we've got a couple of examples here. They are purely fictional. The goal here is really to reinforce that, you know, graphics are a very good tool. They've been used for a very long time to demonstrate alignment or sometimes misalignment, but most seem to be leaning towards using graphics to, again, demonstrate the clear or demonstrate a clear description of the relationship between CAP and these particular measures. But it's also important to remember that, you know, depending upon what the picture paints, there may be a need to provide some context. So that's what the bracketed text is here. This copy, again, is fictional. Words will be dynamic based on a company's situation. They'll be different for every company every year. But without words, you know, it really does leave the picture up to interpretation. So even though this is a simple example, looks at CAP versus company TSR, maybe this company has a long tenured CEO who holds a lot of stock. So the increase in stock price in 2021 had an impact on the CEO's unvested shares, and there's the alignment you have there. And although the stock remained flat in 2022, compensation levels became more reflective of target opportunity. Again, the CD&A is going to be the better source of narrative that explains the board's approach to pay. So if we look at another quick example, here is what you could potentially do for CAP versus net income. Clean, simple bar chart to show this, you can't see my air quotes, but the quote unquote relationship between CAP and this particular financial measure. Maybe the scenario here is that the company's net income rebounded after the pandemic, and as a result, so did the stock price, which, as we know from the prior slide, had an impact on unvested shares and therefore shows the alignment. And then lastly, same story here. We just assumed that this company, for purposes of this example, used EBITDA as their company selected metric, or CSM. And really the question then comes down to how are companies going to decide what to show or what not to show, or what to say and what not to say. And I would say that most companies that I've been talking with, similar to how, you know, the narrative gets created in the CD&A, they're starting to do some scenario planning and preliminary drafting around what the visuals and or narrative could look like based on their own particular circumstances. I mean, even if they don't have the final PVP table calculations, there are steps that can be taken to start drafting things so you'll know what they may sound like and where your challenges may be, and where alignment or misalignment may be an issue. Jill, I'm wondering, have your companies, are you aware, have they started at least drafting some of the narrative based on what you know, or even the traditional CD&A?
You know, if they have for like these kinds of things, I haven't seen it. And I think these, I had to put myself on mute because I was going to talk to myself out loud, I think these are really good visuals. And, you know, it can jump out at, I mean, of course, it'll depend where the bars are, right? I mean, you know, these you can see like 2020 and 2021 are very aligned, and 2022 doesn't look as aligned, but in a way that won't be difficult to explain, right? It's not the opposite where, you know, CSM EBITDA is lower than the other two bars. So I have not seen these, and these are really great. And one of the questions I was going to have is, you know, since I think everybody has access to these slides, I don't know, are these shareable, or do you know, are these not shared? I don't know if they got copies of the actual presentation sent to them.
Yeah, I think that I believe that these are available, and
okay.
You know, again, the examples here, they are truly fictional. And
right.
You know, in full transparency, I'm a creative writer. I am not an analyst. Numbers are not my thing. So I would, you know, would be careful just about, you know, looking at the narrative, but, you know, the point being, the story needs to be carefully told. I think, again, because it's year one, you know, maybe a picture is enough, right, without bullets to support the picture if it's intuitive. I just can't stress enough the importance of referring readers back to the CD&A and making sure to take care that, and we're going to talk about this here quickly in these next steps, that, you know, the pay for performance story that you tell in your CD&A and your governance story, and demonstrating that the board, you know, has a careful, appropriate process for making decisions, and that the executive compensation program is aligned with shareholder interests, is going to be extremely important, probably more important than it's been.
Yeah, okay.
Right, and if I could just add one last thing to that, you know, CEO pay ratio sort of like grew into this big like boilerplate exercise where everybody's doing the same thing year over year. I don't think that this disclosure will get that boilerplate. However, I can imagine many companies saying sort of as a preamble to this item as it's disclosed, this is a disclosure required by the SEC under item 402B for a more detailed or fulsome discussion about how compensation decisions were made by our compensation committee. Please refer to our compensation discussion analysis.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, you know, my point, and I know that everyone, you know, it's going to be very specific to everyone, but I think my point is to, you know, share with their teams how these charts like these, right, really, I think, depict it and tell the story in a very easy to understand and not overly complicated way.
Agreed. Agreed. So, Deb, do you want to talk about next steps? I'm going to take, I mean, it's pretty clear here on the slide, but just to wrap us up and get us towards the end, and maybe we'll have some time to answer some questions.
Yeah. Yep, just quickly, because I know we want to take a couple questions here. The most time-consuming piece of this, I believe, is the data collection to get to your compensation actually paid. So make sure you have adequate either in-house resources or valuation experts or comp consultants that are prepared to do all of these calculations. There could be hundreds of data points you need to collect, particularly in this first year. The other pieces of this are more, you know, discussion points you can have with your compensation committees, which are, as we mentioned, peer group, your compensation selected measure, what goes into your tabular measures, and how you want to tell your story.
Yeah.
Sharon, take it back to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And connected to that, I mentioned it a couple of times, is making sure that, you know, you've started your regular traditional CD&A updates. Resources are going to be stretched, and, you know, the stories do need to be aligned. So, you know, getting a jump start on that drafting process now is highly recommended. And then lastly, and this hasn't been talked about a whole lot, but either way, I think it's going to be really important to be prepared to respond to questions. So you never know, you know, an investor will come to your annual shareholder meeting and have a question about your PVP table. So you might want to consider putting together, you know, top 10 talking points or FAQs that you think or can anticipate you might get based on what your narrative and what your story may look like.
Okay.
I think that brings us back to
Great.
Sarah.
Yeah, we have a few
Jill.
questions that are in the chat, so I'm just going to start. I know we only have a few minutes, but I think this is a really good one. Are these disclosures required of foreign companies that trade on the NASDAQ or trade here in the U.S., and are they applicable to non-accelerated SEC filers?
So those are good questions. I know for non-accelerated filers, so if we are talking about smaller reporting companies are not exempt, but they do have scaled disclosure. So as I mentioned, they only have to provide 2 years initially, 3 years going forward. They will not have to provide the peer group TSR. They don't have to provide, nor do they have to provide the company selected measure.
And what about the foreign?
Right. I can get back to that individually.
Okay. Okay, let's see. Are there limitations on management's participation in this process?
No, in fact, I think it's a management, much of it is a management-driven process, right? Because you have to look at, work with, or outsource a lot of the computations that need to be made, and that's not typically done by compensation committees or their delegates.
Yep. With the SEC really wanting to claw back compensation from management if accounting errors are found, do you see variable comp tied to financial performance going away?
That's a really good question, but I'm wondering if it sounds more like a question about the clawback rules than the pay versus performance rules, which are very relevant, of course, because the SEC just issued final rules on the clawback. But I think that's a good topic for another day.
Based on my perspective of just one individual, I don't see financial performance measures being, tied going away. But I'm not the expert at it. Okay, those are the only questions we have. So with that, I will turn it back over to NACD for some closing comments.